It is such an incredible honor to be here. I've been traveling around the country talking about this message, and one of the things I get criticized for is defending Bill Clinton too much. So I assume that's not going to be a problem here tonight, so it's good to be back here, albeit too brief. First of all, I want to thank Dean Scott not only for introducing me, inviting me, and hosting me, but also for the incredible work he's done over his entire career. My book really documents how vital it was to measure this problem. Because if you can't measure it, you can't realize the extent of it and help the country understand what a vast problem it is that today is affecting 36.2 million Americans. We talked a little before about the politics of measuring it. Every time we document there's a problem, the right goes nuts and says it doesn't exist. Because if the right has to admit we have tens of millions of Americans living in households that can't afford enough food, they have to admit something's very seriously wrong with the policies that allow that to happen. So thank you, Dean Scott. Thank you, Allison Wallace, for inviting me, and thank you, Dean Rutherford, for having me here. And I also want to give a shout out to my former colleague and friend, Lee Powell, who's executive director of the Delta Grassroots Caucus, and you may know them. They do vital work, still talking about the very grave needs of the Mississippi Delta. We made some progress in the Clinton years and other years, but as you know, there are a lot of problems in the Delta region here and in Mississippi and Louisiana, and so I urge you to support their vital work. I just want to tell you, I've been traveling around the whole country, literally from Maine to Alaska, talking about my book and talking about this message, and I was in Alaska last March. Do you remember when the volcano was going off? Remember that? And by the way, it was just a few weeks after a certain unnamed Southern governor got on TV and said, "Why is the federal government wasting money on volcano detection?" You remember that? So just a few weeks after that, a volcano was going off in Alaska, and I was landing there and delayed, and I got to a reception, and people were trying to outdo themselves with descriptions of just how dangerous this volcanic ash was. So some people said, "Oh, it's like coal dust, it'll give you a black lung," and someone else goes, no, it's like fiberglass, it'll really rip apart your insides. And someone else said, no, it's like ground glass. It'll turn you into a bloody pulp. And then the next morning I'm jogging, this is all true, and a moose runs by. And someone takes me aside and say, moose kill more people than bears because they have a really bad kick. But by the way, there was a bear around the corner last week, so you better be careful. And then I take a day off to see some of the scenery, and there's a landslide on the road. This is all true. So then I go to the next reception and say, "I'm from New York," and they go, "You're from New York? Isn't that dangerous?" So we really have to learn about stereotypes. And by the way, I usually speak very fast because I'm from New York, but I'm really slowing down my talk because I'm here in Little Rock. When I did live here, I had to learn the whole concept of visiting. New York, it's cut to the chase, man. What's next? Here, the idea that I have to ask about your family and your dog and, how the Razorbacks did before getting down to business was very shocking for a New Yorker. So now that I started the pleasantries, I visited with you, I can get to the hunger talk, right? I want you to imagine that this is not 2009. I want you to imagine this is the late 1700s, and I want you to come visit me in New York. It'll take a long journey from here, but it's worth it. It was a pretty good town in the late 1790s. What would you see? You'd see people dying everywhere of yellow fever. Hang around in New York a few more decades, what would you see by the 1830s? You would see people dying everywhere of cholera. The cholera death rate in New York City was so amazing that if you transposed it to New York City today, it would be 100,000 people a year dying of cholera. If you were in this part of the country, or New Orleans, or Charleston, or Savannah, what would you see? You'd see people dying everywhere of malaria. Now, what did people believe about these diseases? They believed they were just a natural part of the earth. Like the Atlantic Ocean or the Ozark Mountains. See, I always throw in local references. Or the Mississippi River. People believe they've just always been here, always will be. There's just a set level of disease we just have to live with. And they believed, the elites did, that the reason these diseases were more prevalent in low-income neighborhoods is God was punishing low-income people for the sin of being poor. They were obviously lewd, lascivious. They had too many children. They didn't work hard enough. And if you transpose that today, they don't grow all them food themselves and cook it very slowly from scratch. And that's why God was punishing them for the sin of being poor, and that's why they had all these diseases. Oh, and by the way, people believed we couldn't actually end these diseases. So the most we could do is relieve the suffering a little. Maybe a volunteer or a nun or whoever stayed around to help out could wipe someone's brow and make them marginally less miserable as they died an inevitable death. And that's what people believed about yellow fever, about cholera, about malaria, that they've always been around and they always will be. Now, you didn't know you were going to get a quiz, but I want you to, show of hands, if any of you, while in the United States, have ever contracted yellow fever, malaria, or cholera. And I say while in the United States because there may be some former Peace Corps volunteers at the great Clinton School of Public Service. There may be some people from Heifer International travel overseas. While in the United States, have any of you ever contracted yellow fever, cholera, or malaria? No one? Sort of? Okay. Any of you ever met anyone who's contracted these diseases in the United States? No one? That's amazing. What happened? Where'd they go? We know these diseases are prevalent throughout much of the rest of the developing world today. We know they're warm weather diseases, and ridiculous deniers notwithstanding, North America has gotten warmer over the last few hundred years. Where did these diseases go? Why doesn't the United States have cholera, malaria, or yellow fever anymore? You know why? Government wiped them out. Government wiped them out. Yes, that evil, horrible, occupying force government, if you believe the teabaggers, used to solve major problems. You know, we figured out that yellow fever and malaria were caused by certain types of mosquitoes, and we had government-led eradication efforts. They worked. Cholera is an even better example. We figured out that cholera was caused by bad water that was primarily caused by human civilization. City after city, county after county, town after town built municipal systems to take bad water out of communities and good water in. Now, New York City, we're not shy on our own accomplishments, so we will brag that we have the best pizza and bagels in the world due to this incredible fresh water we have in New York City. No offense to you guys, I'll give you your catfish and barbecue, but I gotta tell you, white bread with a hole in it isn't a bagel. Sorry. Why do we have the best drinking water, we say, on the planet? Because we have this incredible government-run water system that brings water from sometimes hundreds of miles away, an engineering accomplishment that rivals the Romans. And not only did this fresh water give us great bagels and pizza, it also wiped out cholera. You can go to the New York City Department of Health's website and see a chart labeled Death from Pestilence in New York City. That's the kind of fun guy I am. That's the kind of charts I go to. Death from pestilence in New York City. And you see cholera, municipal water system built, cholera went away. And lo and behold, throughout the rest of the country, the same thing happened. Why do I mention this? Why do I start my hunger talks with this discussion? A few reasons. Number one, the same failed assumptions we had as a country then about diseases are the same failed assumptions too many Americans have today about poverty and hunger. The belief that they're just part of the natural environment, that they've always been here, always will be, there's just a set level we have to live with, that we can't wipe them out, so the most we can do is have a little charity. And let they're the fault of poor people themselves. That's what Americans believe now, just as they were wrong about disease, they were wrong about these problems. They're not a set level that's always been here and always will be. As you know, today in the world, there are parts of the world that have more hunger and poverty than the United States. There are parts of the world that have far less poverty and hunger than the United States, and permit me to suggest the difference isn't something intrinsic about natural resources, not something built in about their culture or their society. It is the action of political leaders and economic leaders and world leaders that have allowed these differences to exist. You say, okay, Joel, there's more diversity in America, we have a unique history, it's just not fair to compare us to, Norway. I'd say it is, but let's say it's not. Let's compare us to ourselves. As I discuss in my book, and I'm only giving you the highlights, right? So you're going to have to buy it. As a mother might say, why buy the cow if you get the milk for free? Now, my mother would say, buy the cow and get the milk for free, but that's a whole other story. So I'll give you the highlights. I quote a master's thesis from 1910 from Frances Perkins, who was an incredible figure in American history. She was the first female cabinet secretary. She was Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor. One of the few people with a building named after them in Washington that, in my judgment, actually deserved it. And she helped write the Social Security Act, helped create minimum wage legislation, and she wrote a master's thesis in 1910 on hunger in New York City. And she actually documented that kids were starving to death like they might in the developing world today. Literally just coffee or tea with each meal, maybe a piece of bread. If they were lucky, a rare little scrap of meat, virtually never fresh produce, virtually never fresh, wholesome milk. And things are actually better today than in 1910 for even the hungriest kids in America, because there was no school lunch program then, there was no school breakfast program then, there was no food stamps program then, now renamed the SNAP program, there was no after-school snacks program, no summer meals program. None of that existed. And Frances Perkins also described one kid who lived in the basement back rooms of their parents' apartment. He had a cough that lasted 2 years, was starving, and for his 14th birthday got to go work in a factory. We don't have that today in America, except at the margins of American society, because that has been banned by law. So things actually go up or down. Poverty and hunger were worse until we had the New Deal, until we had the war on poverty. Now, I gotta tell you, it is just an assumption of most Americans that the war on poverty was a total failure. Even progressives I know believe that, there was still poverty at the end, it didn't work. Between 1960 and 1973, the poverty rate in America was cut in half. 16 million Americans left poverty and entered the middle class. It was working, we just stopped fighting it. Now, I'll talk in a little bit about the incredible progress we made under the Clinton administration of bringing poverty down, but the fact is, a certain type of policies bring down poverty, a certain type of other policies bring up poverty. In America, it's not a set level. Now, people say, who knows, this is just opinion. Well, can we ever use the term social science and mean it? We understand 1 + 1 = 2. We don't say, that's just a theory. We don't say, it could be 1 + 1 = 3. We just don't know. But when it comes to history and social policy, we say we just don't know. We do know. We do know from a few decades of history that when you cut taxes on the ultra-rich, claim the money is going to trickle down to everyone else, and then slash social programs, slash work training programs, slash opportunity for people, guess what? People get poorer. And when you invest in programs like Head Start, when you create programs like the AmeriCorps National Service Program that reward hard work with educational opportunity, when you invest in the schools, invest in people, can I use the phrase put people first? Is that too cliche? You reduce poverty and expand economic opportunity. So we know this is not a static level that's just got to be what we have to accept. It is our policies that make poverty and hunger go up or down. The original school lunch program was started as a defense program because generals went to President Truman following World War II and said, "Our boys are too hungry to fight, Mr. President." And that's why President Truman and some very conservative members of Congress created the National School Lunch Program. Senator Richard Russell, who I suggest had some blots on his history, being a leading segregationist, did two great things if you've read Robert Caro's discussion of him in the Lyndon Johnson book. One, stood up for civilian control of the military when Truman fired MacArthur, and two, created the National School Lunch Program. Richard Russell was asked decades later about that. He said, "If I had to leave only one program I worked on intact, it would be the National School Lunch Program." That dramatically reduced hunger. Yet by the late 1960s, even though we had these programs, there were still significant pockets of third world style malnutrition in America. You could still see as late as the 1960s kid with distended bellies. I know some of your work in other decades, you saw some of that as well. You could see it in my home city of New York, in places like Harlem or Bedford-Stuyvesant or Watts or the south side of Chicago, traditional African-American urban areas. You can see in traditionally, overwhelmingly, but not exclusively African-American areas of the South, like the Mississippi Delta. You could see it in overwhelmingly rural white areas from the Ozarks to Appalachia. You could see it in Latino areas of the Texas-Mexico border in places like East Harlem and East LA, and you could certainly see it on Native American reservations. How do we know this? For a few reasons. A team of doctors went throughout the country and actually documented this point by point by point. One of those doctors was Dr. Raymond Wheeler of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and in my research I found letters to him that were described online. You know, most research is pretty boring, I got to admit. So, field notes, blah, 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 check, testimony, check, hate mail. Hate mail? Who would write hate mail to a doctor who had dedicated his life to exposing hunger among children? And that was North Carolina, 1968. He's a white man from the South going down to overwhelmingly African-American neighborhoods. I assumed it was racist, but I wanted to check it out, so I wrote to them, sent them a small check. They sent me this whole box of mail, and sure enough, letter after letter after letter was about how he was a traitor to his race, a lot of N-words, or if they were being sophisticated Negroes, and that they were dirty, they were smelly, they were having too many children. Sound familiar? And that's why they were going hungry. And then further in my research, I found out that segregationists were among the people most opposed to the expansion of the Federal Nutrition Assistance Safety Net. And I make the point that I believe racism is one of the reasons America has never developed a more robust federal safety net for poor people. In countries in Northern Europe where people felt they were supporting people who looked and sounded like them, they were more generous. In America, where people falsely believed they were supporting non-white people, because throughout American history, the majority of people poor, the majority of people hungry, the majority of people on food stamps, the majority of people on welfare were always and are today white. But that's not what Americans believed. Now, lest you think I'm picking on the South, I am not. Number one, or picking on America. Many of these Northern European countries are becoming more diverse. They are having more immigrants, and I don't think it's a coincidence that they are now moving away from their safety net programs. I don't think it's anything unique about one region of the country. I think it's unfortunate human characteristic. And let me pick on my hometown of New York. We've done a bunch of events. We were pressuring Costco chains to accept food stamps benefits. In New York and the rest of the country, until just a few months ago, they didn't accept food stamps. Walmart, I'll have some not great things to say about them, but two great things to say about them. One, low prices are good for poor people, and two, they've accepted food stamps. I know it's dangerous in these parts to criticize them, so I'll say they accepted food stamps way before Costco. And we actually forced Costco now to start accepting it around the country. But when we did this, even in so-called liberal New York, which ain't that liberal, by the way, we're about to have our 5th term in a row of Republican mayor. But New York Times, supposedly this horribly left-wing organ, people posted on their blogs how horrible it is. Costco's going to start accepting food stamps. We like going to Costco because those people and these people didn't go there. And let me suggest it's no longer socially acceptable, even among most bigots, to use the N-word, but I do believe code words like these people and those people are not too far off the mark. And so we see these attitudes are still prevalent today. They said they're dirty, they're smelly. One person actually blogged, I went to one of these stores and someone defecated in front of me. They didn't say defecated, but I've been going to stores in low-income neighborhoods for decades. I've never seen someone go number 2 in a store. But these are the attitudes that are there. So that happened, but even though there was a backlash against those doctors in their report, the most important thing they did is they got CBS News to have a 50-minute documentary in prime time called Hunger in America 1968. It transformed the American political debate. 50 minutes in prime time, they actually showed a malnourished child dying on screen. Now, this was produced by the great Edward R. Murrow, Fred Friendly, and Charles Kuralt as a team. Any of you guys seen Good Night and Good Luck? Fred Friendly character in that movie was played by George Clooney, who I can announce tonight he's going to be playing me in the movie version of my book. I almost blew that one. I told George, though, he's going to have to lose weight, shape up a little to really be credible in that role. So that happened, and Dr. King's Poor People's Movement was camped out on the Washington Mall, and I learned through my research that one of their top demands was the creation of a modern federal nutrition safety net. The reason I mention that is because sometimes people think to build a movement, all we've got to do is raise people's attention, and non-poor people will just magically wake up one morning and say, oh yeah, raise my taxes so I can increase the safety net. I don't think that's realistic. We do need to win over the middle. We do need to convince Americans that these programs are effective and that it's in their self-interest. As Bill Clinton always said, we don't have a person to waste, meaning that our economy depends on the weakest in this economy being productive workers, being good students. So my message is to the non-hungry that it is in your economic self-interest to do something serious about this. Hunger costs our economy $90 billion a year. $90 billion a year, according to a survey from Harvard. Hungry children cost more money to educate and do less well. Hungry workers are less economically productive. Hungry parents can't raise their children as effectively. Hungry senior citizens do not stay independent, and we have to spend far more on their health care costs. So purely economic self-interest, we say to folks, you know what? I've really got to tell you that do something about this problem. A society where tens of millions of people don't earn enough money to buy your products or buy your services is going to have serious problems. Henry Ford, not exactly a left-winger, understood that his workers had to earn enough to buy his cars. When I wrote this book about a year and a half ago now, I guess 2 years ago now when I started writing it, I actually said the last time we had this much inequality of wealth was 1929, and we know what happened after that. And guess what? I don't claim any magic, seeing into the future. It's just obvious common sense that societies with so much inequality of wealth cannot sustain themselves. And just one fact on that. In New York City today, there are 56 billionaires. Last year, there were 64 billionaires. So pity those, eight people who were billionaires last year and only have like 900 million this year. Those 56 billionaires have 27 times the net assets of the annual earnings of all 1.5 million New Yorkers in poverty. Let me repeat that. The 56 wealthiest people in New York City have more money, 27 times more money than the 1.5 million poorest. Now, I am a committed capitalist. My grandparents came here and worked hard and played by the rules, as someone said, and built better lives for their children, their grandchildren. But I am arguing that opportunity capitalism has been replaced by fake crony capitalism that isn't free market forces at all. It is people rewarding their friends. And that's not what my grandparents came here, and many of your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents or great-grandparents came here for the American dream. So, we had this awakening through the media that grabbed public attention to convince people they ought to do something about it, but Dr. King's Poor People's Movement actually organized low-income people. So as important as it is to convince the great American middle, I say even more important is to organize low-income people to fight for their own future. No social movement in history has been won by one people on behalf of another people. Some women in the audience, I gotta tell you, if you guys were just waiting for us men, you still wouldn't have the right to vote today. it was surely extraordinarily vital in American history that white people participated in the civil rights movement, and some even gave their lives for it, the ultimate sacrifice. But if we really think we would have had the African-American president we have today, if it wasn't for African-Americans saying, enough of delay, we demand it now, and organizing to make that demand, we wouldn't have it. The idea that somehow poverty and hunger is going to be the first issue solved with no involvement of the people most affected, I think is preposterous. So one of the things my organization is doing in New York City is we're actually organizing the people who go to soup kitchens and food pantries to fight, to ask for changes in law, to ask for improvements in law. So we know this worked because in the late 1960s, when we had this media attention, when we had this grassroots organizing, we had the most dramatic progress in fighting hunger we've ever had in American history. Richard Nixon ran for president in 1968, denying hunger was a problem at all. Within a year, he held the first White House conference on hunger that had very concrete results, that created the WIC program, that laid the groundwork for the modern food stamps program, that created the first USDA agency to fight domestic hunger. So I have a subhead in my book called Richard Nixon, Thief, Despot, Crook, and one of history's greatest hunger fighters. Why did he change? I believe he changed because there was political pressure to do it. Then Senator Robert Dole and George McGovern, a right-wing senator from Kansas, Bob Dole, left-wing or liberal senator from South Dakota, George McGovern, teamed up to create the modern nutrition assistance safety net in the late 1970s to mid-1970s. And guess what? It worked. By the late 1970s, we almost ended hunger entirely in America. What happened? I started with the secular parable of yellow fever and malaria. I'll give you one more quick secular parable, and that is of bucket brigades. We used to fight fires in America with bucket brigades, one bucket at a time, one bucket at a time, one bucket at a time. Run back. Yeah, look how hard I work for you. One bucket at a time, one bucket at a time, one bucket at a time. They were great. If you guys have read de Tocqueville, he said these kind of voluntary associations are what made America different from that old corrupt Europe, because we had volunteers banding together. The bucket brigades didn't need a big government bureaucracy. They didn't need a big tax spending. You didn't need professionals. It was just good-hearted people, the armies of compassion of their time. There's only one teensy little problem with the bucket brigades. They didn't work. City after city burnt to a crisp. New York City, 1776, whether it was George Washington troops purposely burning down the city so the British couldn't get the prize that is New York or what, New York City gone. Whether it was Mrs. O'Leary's cow that kicked over the lantern or some other cause of the Great Chicago Fire, boom, Chicago gone. We've heard about or read about, if you visited, you know about the incredible earthquakes in San Francisco and Seattle, but it wasn't the earthquakes that destroyed the cities, it was the fires that followed. One more quiz. Raise your hand if during your lifetime a city you've lived in has burnt down entirely. What happened? Government. Oh my goodness. Now, this is an old building. I know, believe it or not, when I lived here, this was the spaghetti factory, right? I actually went to dinner here. So I'm sure I can't see them. There are fire alarms here, required by government, enforced by building inspectors. We replaced volunteer fire departments in most places with professional fire departments, and even rural and suburban areas where there's still volunteer fire departments who do incredible, valuable, brave work. They receive a lot of support and funding and technical assistance from government. But in most big cities, we have professional fire departments. Now, you know, the bucket brigades, not everyone showed up every time someone yelled fire. If they were cold, or I actually found out in my research, some were sick from yellow fever, believe it or not, and not everyone showed up. Professionals are paid by our tax dollars to be on call at their firehouse no matter when the fire happens. And they use pretty antiquated technology, the bucket brigades. One morning at 3 a.m., I couldn't sleep and I woke up. I wonder how much water a bucket brigade delivers in a minute. I'm sure that's happened to you at 3 a.m., right? Common. So I calculated if they were lucky, they'd deliver 60 gallons of water a minute. So I Googled and figured out that a modern fire truck can deliver 1,000 gallons of water a minute. Now let me ask you, your house is burning down. You're on the 3rd floor with your prized possessions, your cat, your copy of All You Can Eat, How Hungry is America. Which would you prefer? A volunteer bucket brigade, which may or may not show up, which can't reach the second floor, no less the third floor with their buckets. They may have buckets that will run out of water, or if you're in the north, could freeze, aren't professionally trained. Would you prefer a professional fire department that your tax dollars have paid to be on call no matter what, with professional fire equipment, professional training, and 1,000 gallons of water a minute that can reach the second floor or the third floor? I think I know the answer. Why do I mention this? Because when it comes to fighting hunger, we have reverted to the bucket brigades. We're giving the country the false impression that we can end hunger one canned food drive at a time, and it's just not right. Now, we only have these standards for poor people. Only when it comes to poor people do we say, oh my goodness, charity's enough. Now, let's say occasionally it snows in the Ozarks, right? Let's say there's a snowstorm and you live in Fayetteville and you work here. I know it's a long commute. See, I'm showing off my Arkansas geography here. Or you're in Walmart and you want to deliver goods. It snows. Which would you like? Churches to voluntarily decide whether some people in the church may want to get a shovel and may or may not go onto the highway and may or may not decide which patch of the highway to part of? Or would you prefer your tax dollars to pay a professional crew with a professional plow to clean the highway? Of course, the answer is professionals. But yet again, when it comes to poor people, oh, let the volunteers do it. You know the community crime patrols, you see the sticker on the door that if you see something, say something? Raise your hand if you'd prefer that to a professional police force. We need both. We need citizen action, we need volunteers, and we need government to work collectively to solve these problems. Working together as a team. I can't understand conservatives say, we want the Razorbacks to work together as a team. We want a sports team to work together as a team, but society working together as a team, that's socialism. That's ridiculous. That is America at its best, collectively solving big problems that cannot be solved alone by individuals. Crazy talk, I know. Now let me say this. First of all, I'll talk about the efficiency. I'm going to wrap up and take questions, but I do want to make this point, that people assume that charities are more efficient. I calculate that the food stamps program has administrative overhead of 15%. Many pantries and kitchens and food banks, when you combine all the steps of getting the food there, is at least 20, 25, 30%. The food stamps program is actually more economically efficient than many of those other programs. Number one. Number two, let's talk about scope. Most of the food, or much of the food distributed by food banks, soup kitchens, and food pantries in America is actually government food. And a lot of people don't want to tell you that because they think you won't give them money if they know the evil government's involved. But even with that, all the food drives in America comprise maybe 3% to maybe 10% if you're lucky, maybe 15% of what an average food bank gives out. But even with that, all the food banks, soup kitchens, and food pantries in America distribute maybe $3 billion worth of charitable food. That's a lot, but there's 36.2 million Americans living in food-insecure households. The Federal Nutrition Assistance Safety Net is $65 billion a year, 20 times what all the charities in America give out. Now, it's not enough. In the beginning of the Clinton administration, the president dramatically increased funding for the food stamps program in his infamous 1993 budget plan, which all you heard was it raised taxes. They didn't tell you it raised taxes only on the wealthy and actually gave millions of working Americans tax cuts through an expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit Program. Then the Gingrich Republicans took over Congress, and even things we tried to do that I thought were common sense, that really defied ideology. Secretary of Agriculture Glickman, my immediate boss in the Clinton administration, had me run for him a community food security initiative that was working with faith-based nonprofit groups and secular nonprofit groups to forge partnerships with the federal government to better serve the people. And yet, so-called conservatives who, in another era, with another leader, say, what a great idea, hated the idea, and actually put language in an appropriations bill trying to prevent us from even doing that. Despite that, we had incredible progress. And let me just say just a few words about welfare reform, because that is a key cornerstone of the Clinton legacy. What he understood was the system was broken. Not only was it not serving taxpayers, it was not serving people on welfare. The way he started welfare reform here in Arkansas long before he became president was all about helping people move towards long-term self-sufficiency. And this is a perfect example of the political system being broken due to left-right paralysis and people seeing all problems through their preconceived notion. Both the left and the right were against the idea that poor people would work for totally different reasons. The right had ridiculous ideas that poor people were just too lazy or culturally inept and they couldn't work, and too many people on the left had a patronizing idea that people who are poor were just too oppressed to work. Bill Clinton understood that poor people were working, wanted to work, and wanted the dignity to work, but wanted a job that would help lift them out of poverty. It's not a coincidence that under the Clinton administration, welfare reform was combined by a significant reduction of poverty. And it's not a coincidence that in the subsequent 8 years, welfare reform was accomplished in conjunction with a major increase in poverty. It stopped being about moving people from welfare to work and started being about moving people from welfare to homeless shelters and soup kitchens like the one we're dealing with today. The bucket brigades aren't enough. We need pantries and kitchens to fill in the gaps, but we cannot give the impression that they are the long-term solution to a systematic, fundamental economic problem that impacts 36.2 million Americans. I'll close with just a few points about my solutions and then open it up for questions. I said that a Harvard study said we lost $90 billion a year to our economy because of this problem. I actually calculated that 2 years ago, probably a little more now with the bad economy, but 2 years ago we could have solved this problem entirely for $24 billion in additional food purchasing power of low-income people. Now let me ask you, you're smart Arkansas residents here, and I know the whole story of the Arkansas Traveler, how you dupe us dumb Yankees coming here, so I'll talk straight to you. A handyman or a handywoman comes to you and says, you know what, there's a hole in your roof. You're losing $90 in heating and cooling costs over the year because of this hole in your roof, and I can prove I can fix it for $24. Would you take the deal? I think you would. Well, if we're losing $90 billion as a society because our children are too malnourished to learn, our workers are too malnourished to work, and yes, we don't have Somalia-like starvation, but we do have people choosing between food and rent. We do have people choosing between food and health care. We do have adults not going without food so they can feed their children. And the greatest irony of all, we have obesity pushed and added to by hunger and poverty because nutritious food doesn't even exist in many low-income neighborhoods and towns, and when it does, they can't afford it. So, we have these problems. Today, we could end it with a lot more money than we spend. Isn't that a good deal? How can we end it? Number one, have a serious war on poverty, again, with a focus on living wage jobs. People working full-time should not be hungry, and they should not be poor. That's one of the reasons President Clinton focused so much on expanding the earned income tax credit with the idea the best social policy isn't just a job, but a living wage job. Number two, let's expand and reform the modern nutrition assistance safety net. There are more than a dozen federal programs. Let's combine them into one basic program, make it easier to apply, stop treating poor people like criminals because they need benefits from the government, just as every rich person on the planet gets help from their government. So reform the federal nutrition safety net. Have a serious child nutrition reauthorization bill. I'm so thrilled to be in the state of Senator Blanche Lincoln, who, as you probably know, is now the chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee, a very important job, and she has pledged to push through a very strong child nutrition reauthorization bill this year, which hopefully will put us down the road towards meeting President Obama's goal to end child hunger by 2015. And I urge you to write her to thank her for her leadership and to gently push her and Senator Pryor and your congresspeople to do a little more and to get the money to do it. First, we need to have universal in-classroom breakfast. Every kid gets free breakfast in the classroom, regardless of family income. The paperwork we could reduce, the bureaucracy we could reduce by doing that would more than save the extra money on the food. Lastly, we need more community gardens, we need more farmers markets, we need more nutrition education, but unlike some of my foodie friends like Michael Pollan, please, please, please do not say that's the only answer to hunger, that every poor person can just grow something themselves. It's got to be in context of this broader reform in social justice and wage creation. And to my slow food friends, I hate to tell you, telling working people that making food more inconvenient is somehow more virtuous, I don't think is an answer either. Low-income people don't have money, they don't have time. We've got to make food healthy, affordable, and convenient for low-income people. We do all those things, we can end hunger in America. Told you about the 14-year-old who worked in a factory. You know, we used to have even more brutal child labor in America. You know about breaker boys? There were kids 8, 9, 10 years old. They were sent to work in the front of anthracite coal mines just because Their fingers were small. They lost limbs. They lost arms. They got black lung disease, died in their teens for dollars a month. America used to think that was inevitable. And now we think that's unthinkable. A lot of things we used to think were inevitable in America, and now it's unthinkable. Slavery, that women couldn't vote. All these social problems we have solved. I want you to work to build a political movement necessary to end hunger in America as a down payment on ending poverty in America. This nation has nearly 400 billionaires. We can afford to make sure Americans don't have to go through the trash to get their breakfast, as a school principal in the Bronx told me they saw. With your help, we're going to take something that is now seen as inevitable, hunger and poverty, like yellow fever and cholera and malaria seen as inevitable. Child labor was seen as so inevitable, the Supreme Court ruled twice that Congress did not have the power to ban it, and now it is unthinkable. With your help, the idea of people choosing between cancer medicine and food is going to be unthinkable. The idea of people becoming obese and getting diabetes and heart disease and hypertension because they can't afford nutritious food, that's going to be unthinkable. The idea of a school child going through the dumpster in back of their school to get their breakfast in America, with your help, that's going to be unthinkable too. Thank you. Questions, comments, complaints?
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you so everyone can hear you.
And I'd really love to start with someone who vehemently disagrees with me, because I gave a talk like this. A few months ago in what I thought was a pretty liberal church, and someone blogged. And by the way, I stayed and answered every question that someone would ask me from the floor. And then some people embarrassed to ask me from the floor, so after I signed my books, I stayed and answered every question afterwards, answered every single question. No one criticized me. And then someone sends me a blog a few days later. This jerk was so arrogant, he didn't want to hear what anyone else had to say. No.
In the back, Adam.
How's it going? My name is Graylin Johnson. I'm a student here. Thank you so much for that message. It was very powerful. I don't know if I missed it or not, but are you suggesting that the solution and the change is top down, bottom up, or a common ground type of a solution? And by top down, I mean government.
I think it's bottom up to get the top to do its job. And let me say one more thing about government versus the nonprofit sector. When I was in government, people said, oh, you're pro-government, you're biased. When you work in the nonprofit sector, you'll believe in government less and understand that nonprofits are great. And I told some people at dinner the story. When I worked in the government for the Clinton administration, people thought I was a dog, a bureaucrat, or a political hack. And now that they hear I work for a nonprofit group, they think I have a halo, like a Mother Teresa. I wasn't a dog then. I'm not an angel now, trust me. I was doing much of the same work. And you talk about legitimacy. Forget, I gave you the specifics of why, from a concrete, just logistical basis, nonprofits can't do this, can't even come close to doing this. If you doubled, look, Feeding America, one of the largest feeding charities in America, actually lost money last year in the recession. But let's say they magically, miraculously doubled what they were doing, that would decrease hunger by a few million people. If you did what I suggested and increased the safety net by 41%, that would entirely end hunger in America. And if Bill Gates was taxed at the rate he would have been in 1978, he alone could pay for that quite literally. So I don't think government is the only answer. Government does a lot of things wrong, but at least we have some recourse. We can vote people out. We can run for office ourselves. I run a nonprofit. Who elected me? I was picked by my board of directors. They're fine, upstanding people. Conservatives want to say the nonprofits have more legitimacy. I actually say I think government has more legitimacy. No one elected nonprofits. You actually elected your elected officials. Now, not in New York, where our governor, our lieutenant governor, our junior senator, our state controller weren't elected, but in most states, people are elected. So I think we should cut a deal that if government goes back to doing what it does best, having a basic safety net and helping people get living wage jobs and spurring economic growth and having a basic safety net and grinding out benefits for people who need it. My mother was on Social Security for a few decades. They weren't late a day. I call it McBenefits. If government can do that best, that nonprofits can do what nonprofits do best. Individualize help, be entrepreneurial, be quick, but as help people not just with immediate food needs, but with job training, with other kinds of counseling. But as long as nonprofits in America are saddled with just feeding people, or housing homeless people, or just basic needs that I think the government should be doing, there's no way we can possibly do what government should do. So I think we all have a role to play. But I do point out that we talk about what's patriotic. I happen to think volunteering at a soup kitchen is patriotic, but I actually happen to think paying your taxes so our government can get kids school lunch is also patriotic.
Dewi?
Hi, I'm Ratnasari Dewi. I'm from Indonesia. Thank you for being here, Mr. Berg. I'm a student here. By the way, I still have malaria in Indonesia because the government doesn't eradicate that.
Repeat that?
We still have malaria in Indonesia because the government doesn't eradicate that yet.
Yes. And there are some people with significant wealth in Malaysia, are there not?
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, in America, there's never been a lack of food. Even in the Great Depression, we see the pictures of the Dust Bowl and think, oh, there was a lack of food. That was a few states, important states, Oklahoma, Kansas, parts of Texas, but the great grain-producing states of Iowa and Illinois and Ohio, that's not where the Dust Bowl was. Even in the Great Depression, we had an overproduction of food in the United States, and that crashed commodity prices brought them down so low, and that's one of the things that killed farmers. So we've never had a lack of food in America in much of the word. It's a lack of money of people to buy food.
My question is, how do you involve the business sector in eliminating the hunger in the United States? Because I came here like 5 months ago, and when I go to restaurant, I cannot eat the whole food because it's just too big. And for instance, like some of the junk food restaurant, they sell like super size and big portion, and with very unhealthy food. So how do you see we can involve them as well? And the second one, how do you see the foreign policy of United States government? They like do war, like for instance in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and they should have put their budget on the national budget for eradicating poverty or hunger, I think. Thank you.
Two easy questions. The first I would say, I am extraordinarily grateful when businesses give to nonprofit groups. And I'm extraordinarily grateful when they give money to my organization. But the first and most important thing they can do is pay their workers enough so their workers don't go hungry. Goldman Sachs, they've even given my group a little money, so I hope they don't see this video. Very little money. But they're giving bonuses of hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the workers in their cafeteria, and their office is just a block from me, are making a little more than minimum wage, can't afford to feed their families. Now they say they're not our employees, they work for a contractor. So the first thing businesses should do, should pay their workers. I am a capitalist. I think if someone works darn hard, they should have even 2 or 3 vacation homes. But does someone really need 5 vacation homes if they're not paying their workers enough to feed their families? I don't think that's socialism, I think that's American tradition of looking out for the other guy. So that's number one. But I do think businesses should, when they have people volunteering, they shouldn't come to nonprofits and say, oh, we want 50 employees to volunteer on one day, serving soup. We have enough volunteers to do that. They should use people in a strategic way to help small nonprofits with accounting, to help them set up websites, to provide writers to help edit their grants. That's far more important in serving soup. And then they can help with things like donation. You mentioned extra food. I will say, at the urging of my then boss, Secretary of Agriculture Glickman, who was very interested in food donations, President Clinton did 2 things. He signed into law a bill that shielded good faith donors from liability if they donated, and that was actually a bipartisan accomplishment with a Republican Congress, so I'll give them credit for that. And he also signed an executive memorandum directing all federal agencies to work to make sure extra food they had in their cafeterias, that USDA had on farms we were working with, that Department of Defense facilities had, to donate that to feed the hungry, and that was actually my job to help implement that. So that certainly helped at the edges. I won't go too much with foreign policy, and I will just say that I've said it would cost about $24 billion to end hunger in America. That equaled about 3 months of warfare in Iraq. And just say internationally, not to suck up to another Clinton, but what Secretary of State Clinton is doing today I'm not an expert on World Food Aid, but what I know of what she and President Obama are doing on food aid and really refocusing it on international development and helping small farmers overseas rather than just dumping huge American commodities overseas is absolutely the right way to do it. One of the things President Clinton started was the Global Food for Education program, helping developing countries start school meals programs, and that I think is a great program, another feather in his legacy. Sorry to keep mentioning Clinton here, but I can't do it anywhere else. So.
Go right here.
Hi, Amanda Filial Perez. I'm a student at the College of Public Health. I appreciate your talk about government's involvement and the history of how we've been successful in tackling some of public health issues. How do you think government should be involved in addressing the availability of foods in low-income communities? And also, how should we tackle the issues of dealing with the low cost of high energy density foods?
Well, one of the things my organization has done, we started a pilot project in New York City with community-supported agriculture. You know what those are, where you buy a share in small farms, often organic farm, and instead of being paid off in money, the payment, the dividends you get, so to speak, are some of the produce or other goods they produce. And most CSA projects, unfortunately, around America have sort of been boutique yuppie projects where low-income people are either ignored or an afterthought. We started this project where low-income people were the centerpiece. So using some funding through the state of New York and our local United Way, we gave some shares for free to local pantries and kitchens, and then for family shares, we had a three-tiered structure where the not wealthy people, but people slightly above average subsidized it a little. People at middle income paid about cost, and the low income people we subsidized. Partially with grant money we got. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was very generous. Fund that. I know they've been working with the Clinton Foundation on anti-obesity work, and then we also allowed people to use food stamps. We've helped farmers markets get accept food stamps benefits. Lee, when he was at USDA, was in the forefront of trying to make sure that we did that. It was difficult because food stamps used to be paper and they were easier to accept at farmers markets, and they became electronic. That did a lot of good things, reduce fraud, reduce stigma, but made it hard to use them at farmers markets. But we really need to reorient the business community. They say, oh, gee, we're not going into low-income neighborhoods with supermarkets because people don't want it. That's just not true. A Pathmark grocery store located in Harlem a bunch of years ago, and it's one of their highest grossing stores in America. People say, oh, the free market. If there was money, they'd make it. No offense, but under segregation, stores willfully turned away lots of their consumers, and it had nothing to do with the free market. And I think there's still biases against why stores don't want to be in inner cities. By the way, as you know, this isn't just an urban problem. You can drive 30 miles, 40 miles out of here and find food deserts in many towns in Arkansas that just don't have fresh produce. And I think we should shift at least some agricultural subsidies in a cotton and rice state. I want to be careful here, cut off the microphone, but that there should be a little more focus on vegetable, production and evening the scales and really helping, small farmers. And I'm about to publish a paper for the Progressive Policy Institute, a think tank you heard I work for that President Clinton was involved with before he was president, suggesting a food jobs initiative from this new administration. In the same way we've had the focus on green jobs, we should have a focus on food jobs, and not just growing food and selling food, but really on food processing, because that's where the real money in food is, in value added brought to the food. And there could be small scale processors in rural towns and urban communities all across America creating jobs and helping people get healthier food. Usually I speak in a place and I know my answers are among the longest that have ever been given in the place. Here I'm pretty confident that's not the case.
I'm Martha Hyde, and I'm one of those people who works for the government.
Thank you for your service on behalf of all of us.
Oh, thank you. There were just some common threads in there that I think as government employees we sometimes hear. And I applaud everything that you've said and congratulate you for all of your many successes and continue your work. I'm really interested in one point that you made and how we can address this, and that's related to government programs, because through the years in my work, I've had the opportunity to work with WIC, and now the SNAP program, the Special Nutrition Program, which has the Child and Adult Food Program, summer lunch, on and on. And I wholeheartedly agree about combining those into one effort or somehow getting to that point. But my question is, do you see any movement? I guess I have two
No.
questions.
I'll explain
I'll
why.
sit down.
Look, just to give you a few programs, the food stamps program in most states, it's now called the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. The name was changed by the last Farm Bill, but most of you probably still know it as food stamps. Most states, you have to earn below 130% of poverty to get food stamps. For the WIC program, the Women's, Infants, and Children program that provides special meals to pregnant women and children under 5, you have to earn below 185% of the poverty line. To get free meals, your family has to be below 130% of the poverty line. For reduced price meals, you have to be below 185% of the poverty line. For commodity distribution, depends on your state. For other programs, depends on your state or locality. For each of those programs, there's a separate application and a separate bureaucracy at the federal level, at the state level, and the local level. So if you're a conservative, you should hate that there's all this overlapping bureaucracy. If you're a progressive, and maybe some conservatives care too, that low-income people have to go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 offices, often leave work, because the fastest growing population of people on the food stamps program are working families, so they have to leave work to prove they're virtuous enough as a worker and fill out forms at all these places. So I say, combine these all into one program, have one application, raise the level to 185% of the poverty line, which would make it in the upper 20s as opposed to the lower 20s. Because right now, right, if you're making 129% of the poverty line, I'm just making up these numbers, but let's say you're making $21,000, you work hard, add extra hours, and move up to $23,000, you could entirely lose your food stamps. It's not like it ramps down, right? It's not like you get 80% when you make a little more, you get nothing. Insane public policy. So I say combine them all, have a higher eligibility limit, make it available for the working poor in a serious way, and reduce that bureaucracy. Why is it going nowhere? I gotta tell you, most hunger groups in the country hate my idea. It's shocking to me, and it really, I understand why. They are worried that if you combine them all and conservatives get into power, it would be easier for them to cut one program than a number of programs. That may be true, but look at the other side. It's a lot harder to raise it if there are all these separate programs. And I believe progressives always have to be for reform. Franklin Roosevelt said we have to be for persistent experimentation. If we cede reform to non-progressives, then you're never going to get advance. And I also think the best defense is an offense. And I just think, look, you look at polling data, and the American people say a number of contradictory things. Number one, we desperately want to end hunger. Number two, we don't think government can do it. Number three, we think there's waste and fraud and bureaucracy in these programs. So let's cut a deal. We'll reduce the bureaucracy, be tougher than ever on fraud, but stop treating poor people like criminals because they need help from a program that their tax dollars have already paid for. So I'd urge you, if you support the idea, contact other hunger advocates, say get on board, contact your elected officials, and say do it. Now, even though they may not combine the program, I think we have a halfway way of getting there, that there's a lot more likelihood that people would combine the applications and do that electronically. So you could still have all the requirements, and with all modern technology, there's no reason you couldn't combine 10 applications into something that feels and looks and acts to an applicant like one application.
We have time for just one more, and then we're going to start the book signing. And yeah, you had your hand up.
Hi, my name is Adam Moreland. I'm a student here. Thank you very much for coming. Unfortunately, I left my wallet at home. Otherwise, I'd give you the $24 million right now.
Oh, okay.
Until I can get that to you, I believe people...
Go up to Bentonville with a tax collector. Sorry. Sorry.
I believe if people have the knowledge about food issues, about hunger issues in the country, that they will be... it's easy to motivate them to take action. What resources, besides your book, of course, are out there for us, the people in this room, to learn about the issues, share those issues with the people in our community, and take political actions to get these changes made?
Well, I'll plug the website of my organization, the New York City Coalition Against Hunger. It's at www.nyccah.org, nyccah.org for the New York City Coalition Against Hunger. Sometimes people leave out the against or say we're for hunger. I say, no, that's the Heritage Foundation. So go there, and we actually have sample letters you can send to Senator Lincoln and Senator Pryor. I know they want to do the right thing, but often people have to be reminded and nudged or thanked for their leadership. And we do have sample letters there, and go under End Child Hunger. It's also a good website, FARC.org, FARC.org, and they're sort of one of the main national lobbyist groups on this, so there's good information on there. And in the back of my book, I do have an appendix listing a bunch of other groups, so even if you don't have money, or you can read at the library here, or you can steal one of them right now and write down in the back of the book. Don't steal them, but you can write down lots of websites there. So that's a start. But I actually tell people, it's a shocking thing to say, I believe that 5 minutes contacting your elected officials will have 10 times more impact than 5 months serving soup.